So, guys, welcome to the Impact Stage here at Techsylvania 2020. We have some awesome speakers the next 2 days, and this morning we are kicking it off with Esther Delignat. She has been investing in early stage companies for over 3 years. She joined La Famiglia a year ago after spending some time at Seed Series A Fund Oxford Capital. And she is speaking today on creating and maintaining an innovative culture in B2B. So please virtually welcome Esther. Welcome, Esther.
Hi everyone, thank you so much. Can you see me? Am I live in stereo?
You look great. It's perfect.
Okay, amazing. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for introducing Trevor. Really appreciate it. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to do was give you a couple of introductory notes. The first one being on where I'm coming from and why I'm talking about the topic that I'm talking about. So I guess, honestly, I'd rather focus on the content, as that's what you're here for. But very quickly on myself. So I work for a venture capital fund called La Famiglia. We do early stage investments in B2B software. So really what our fund does is bridging traditional industries and tech companies. And this is really the perspective I'm coming from today around, innovation and culture in B2B, because I effectively interact on a daily basis with both early stage tech founders and large industrial groups that are looking for, innovative solutions and innovative tools. So that was to give you a little bit of context on sort of my background and where I come from today. The second thing I wanted to touch on in the introduction is, why did I particularly slot in, B2B? And I think the question that arises for many of you is, isn't an innovative culture something that is exactly the same across both consumer and enterprise? So the answer is yes, 100%, which is why also a lot of the examples that I will be using in this talk are from consumer as well. I think the real difference between consumer is that the customer feedback loops in B2B are a lot longer, which makes innovation even trickier and makes B2B companies a lot more reactive. And I think there's a quote from Robert Walcott, who's the co-founder of the Kellogg Innovation Network, who said about B2B customers that, if they're telling you that they need something, they're probably also telling your competitors the same thing. So it's not enough to stay ahead of the competition to just be reactive to customers' demands in the B2B space. And that means that, in short, finding the equivalent of the Pepsi challenge in B2B is really hard. And so I just wanted to, highlight that, straight off the bat from the beginning. But at the end of the day, in fact, innovation culture is the same and shares the same characteristics across consumer and enterprise. So that was the second part of the introductory note. The third part is really, I think a lot of you probably, especially those that work at startups or have founded or co-founded startups, are wondering, why is this really relevant, to startups and to the tech industry? Isn't, tech equal innovation? Aren't they the most innovative? Once again, yes. I think the only thing that I want to highlight here is, don't get too cocky. And I think every small startup and hopefully yours as well, as I'm sure it will, eventually becomes an enterprise and a larger company. And so, the issue is not only how do you create that culture in the first place, but also how do you retain it as your company grows. So that was the third heads up as an introduction. The fourth and the last heads up that I do want to touch on, because I think it's important from a macro perspective, is the dark side of innovation. So I think the title of the talk is really spinned out positively in a positive light, because fundamentally from where I come from, I'm a huge believer that innovation is a net positive. However, I think it is important to highlight that innovation also has, let's say, a more obscure side that I really want to acknowledge here. So let me take the example of Google, because it is a B2B company, and I think it has an interesting story to tell there. So Google's innovation was twofold. The first innovation phase that they had, from their incorporation in 98 to roughly '01, was focused really on the high-performing, best-in-class PageRank algorithm. It was solely related to search, and it meant that users who provided behavioral information to Google got out in exchange better search results and better access to information than never had before. that is the positive innovation part, right? So customer-centric innovation, amazing, everyone is happy. The second innovation that came with the explosion of the dot-com bubble was the fact that, at the point of the explosion of the bubble, the markets really started to value profit over revenue. Again, I will say, and Google had like nothing to show here, right? So they weren't really generating revenue at all because they weren't monetizing off of search, and they weren't yet into the advertising space. And so what they did was really shifted from a B2C model of providing a search engine to a B2B model. And don't be fooled, it still is a B2B model today. And what they did in terms of innovation was AdWords and AdSense technologies. And I think how positive that innovation AdWords and AdSense was is really questionable. For anyone that's interested, actually, I recommend reading The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff. To anyone interested in this topic, it's a really good book. But I think the main point that I'm making here is, the talk that I am about to make really promotes innovation as a positive force, because I fundamentally believe that it is. But also, don't forget that it is not just about the quest for innovation. Do you at times take a step back and wonder, where is that innovation taking me in the grand scale of things? Is it really, a positive innovation? Or, as with any technology that has, the opportunity in a negative way to be, spinned out in something that I guess we would classify as, bad or dangerous, but do make sure that, you take that step back and ponder. So that is all in terms of introductory notes. And now I really dig into, the grain of creating and maintaining an innovative culture in B2B. It is a super multidimensional, super multifaceted topic to explore. So I think today I will really focus on two pieces of advice for you all that I hope will help it keep a little bit streamlined in terms of messages. So one advice is a little bit softer, and the second advice is a little bit harder and more around implementing that culture. So I guess starting with the first advice. So, the advice number one, and I think the absolute key in building innovative cultures that we see in startups and that we also see in industrial groups that tend to have the most innovative cultures, is that innovation is about candor. It's about candor, it's about honesty, it's about open feedback, it's about open-mindedness. And I think this one advice really comes from a second book that I recommend, which is Ed Catmull's Creativity Inc. And this is a book that he wrote about the Pixar culture of creativity. And I can really only echo, what his point was around candor. I really recommend reading the book if you're interested in the topic. But effectively, so Ed's main point is that a hallmark of a healthy creative culture is that the people within the company and within the organization have to feel free and safe to share ideas, to share opinions, to share criticism, because the decision making will always be better if you draw on the collective knowledge and on raw opinions of an organization as a whole, rather than on the leadership group or on, group XYZ within that organization. Now, the way this is done at Pixar is through what they call the brain trust. So the brain trust was developed really organically. It was in the beginning a small group of really, really candid, really good humored, super positive relationship among 5 of the people at Pixar, particularly the 5 people that led and edited the production of Toy Story, which, if you remember, was one of the first films that Pixar did, one of the first sort of future, full feature length films that it did in '95, which will throw back most of us. And it was effectively just a working group of friends, and friends that were comfortable enough around each other to criticize, to disagree openly on creative decisions without ever taking it personally. And then as the brain trust proved really successful and grew, it came to include several dozens of participants across the whole Pixar organization. So not only those, 5 original friends, which, in the tech industry, you would probably equate to the first, 5, I guess, founding teams or co-founders of a company, but also, to people across the organization, across departments, across functions, whose only purpose was really to openly challenge each other in creative decisions. And to illustrate how successful that brain trust was, remember that since Toy Story in '95, Pixar has been at the origin of Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, Ratatouille, Wall-E, Up, Inside Out, and all of those have been critically acclaimed on their own, standalone, but also more generally, Pixar is known as one of the most innovative enterprises and large groups in the US, and in the world. And I think that is, at least fundamentally, to my perspective, and equating that to what we see within our own startups, the founding teams and the organizations and the startups and then the scale ups that have the most innovative culture and always reinvent themselves are the ones where you have an equivalent to a brain trust, whether that is institutionalized one way or another, or whether that is just permissive throughout the organization. And I think it really is just, a mindset of, you have to accept the tough decisions, push people out of their comfort zone, and that includes yourself. Now, as a manager, you are in charge of creating that company culture that encourages dissent, discord, and black sheeps without marginalizing them. I think you are the one, and it is really important, that has to find your own brain trust. Now, for those of you out there who are, in the startup world particularly, but I think again still true in industrial groups, ideally your board can be your brain trust, right? And again, this is true for a number of companies at La Famiglia, where the board effectively is the one place where founders themselves get challenged openly without negative criticism, but as a step forward for their for the next challenges, and where they can openly discuss what is going well within an organization, what is not going so well, and how do I tackle the not going so well. And so hopefully that is one place where you can find a safe haven. But I think, again, important to remember that this isn't solely something that has to be confined to the founder role or to the to the C-level role. It has to be something that you reproduce across your organization. And so my advice for today really is, again, innovation is about candor, and you have to find a way to institutionalize that candor and make it permeate through your whole organization, ideally through a method that resembles in one way or another the brain trust that Pixar has reproduced. And again, I think this is something that we've seen in the most successful industrial groups and companies that we work for. Now, as a warning, I would say you will probably, in that process of building that culture that encourages dissent, be confronted with three types of fear, and I think it's very important that you're aware and prepared for them. So, three types of fear that I have seen hinder candor. One is the fear of looking stupid, and or the fear of offending, which I think are both natural human biases. One being for recognition, and one being for, I guess, good social terms. So, fear of looking stupid, fear and or fear of offending. Now, I think solutions to that. So to give an example and illustrate maybe. So it's the typical, you're in a room of 5 and you have a question, and probably like everyone around the table has the same question, and you don't want to ask it because it just sounds stupid, and so everyone is going to look at you thinking, oh well, that is a dumb question. The fear of offending is, if I actually give real criticism to someone, then they will take it personally, and then we'll know how that snowballs. So I guess for light solutions on that first fear and how to tackle it, I think there's maybe two. So you do have some great team building exercises that some of our companies have done internally. One of them, and that we've actually done ourselves at La Famiglia, which we found great, is called the life timeline exercise. It's a great one to counter the fear of looking stupid and the fear of offending, and effectively it just means that the exercise consists in everyone within a team or within a group drawing the life timeline with the ups, but also with the downs, and then walking everyone through that timeline and explaining, okay, this was a high in my life, why? This was a low in my life, why? And I think that really just helps with the second part, which is showing vulnerability. And I think another way to institutionalize that could be the method that one of our portfolio companies does. They have a board of failures, effectively, where when throughout your day something fails along the way, and it was your fault or it was the fault of the environment, but something happened, you just write out, okay, here is my failure of the day. And that really helps to just, again, show vulnerability, show people that it's okay to fail along the way, and that everyone does. And so looking stupid is not even a thing anymore. And it also helps just create the bonds that mean that when I or you or anyone else on your team will say something to team member number 2 or team member number 3, it really won't be about that team member. It really will be about the project, or the idea, or the exercise, or whatever it is that you are criticizing openly. So I think that's the first fear that you'll always be confronted with, and that you have to be prepared to fight when that can hinder candor within an organization. The second fear really is that we see a lot, is the fear of retaliation and the power dynamics within an organization. Now, to link that back to the brain trust at Pixar, so the brain trust has no authority, right? It really is just a discussion platform. People get together, they discuss the film, be it Toy Story or something else, and then the brain trust doesn't do anything off the back of it, right? Whoever is the creative director of that film can take on whatever they want out of the brain trust sessions. They can accept some of the ideas, they can reject all of them, for all anyone cares. It's not like the brain trust will tell them, oh, we said this, you should have done that, right? So I think it really is important to avoid that fear of retaliation, which basically comes from, okay, if I really criticize something, then someone is gonna replicate, and I might get fired, or I might get like a negative review in my feedback, or whatever for your employees. And I think the alternative of just, again, not the brain trust not having any kind of authority is one. And I think the second one was actually highlighted by Ika at Supercell, so founder of Supercell. And one thing that he said is, you always have, as a founder and as a general collective organization, to at some point disagree and commit. And this is something we use a lot in the VC world as well, because we disagree on some of the decisions of investments X and Y. Maybe you disagree as a manager, and maybe 20% of your employees also disagree with an idea or a project or a new innovative task that you might undertake. But at the end of the day, if the majority agrees and you decide to go for it, then you have to really commit to that and taking that idea forward, and not half bake it and say, oh, okay, fine, let's go for it, and then not put the commitment behind. And if you really are someone who is able to disagree and commit, people will see that their contribution is valued, and that you're not king in the castle. And that is, I can't even tell you how fundamental that is to all of the companies and industrial groups that we work for. So that was the second fear that I wanted to highlight. The third fear that I wanted to highlight is really the fear of failure and past success blindness. So I think when you're in a larger organization, particularly, so this is less relevant for startups, but once you start growing and once you start seeing those early successes, so bringing back to Pixar, once they saw, the massive success story that was Toy Story, you always have, two natural reactions. One is, basically getting blinded by the past successes and effectively starting to ignore market changes and signals that the market is sending you that something is going wrong within your industry or within your company. So that's the first reaction. The second reaction, and it's an and or an or, is really on the other extreme, that you become too conscious that, like any good VC disclaims, past performance is not a predictor of future performance. And so really don't be complacent, and also don't be afraid. And I think if it makes you feel better, CB Insights has this great article. It's called something like 160 biggest product failures of all time or something, and it's amazing. It's got the most random products ever, and really you read through it and you think, God, like how did anyone validate this idea? Like, it was just terrible. But they just, they iterate and they try, and that means that they will fail along the way, and that is also true of of yourself and of your company. And so I think that is the third fear that you will have to fight and be conscious of, but really find the mechanisms to push back on all of those three. So that was the first advice that I wanted to give you. So again, the main headline is really is nothing to reinventing the wheel, but I think is just grasping the importance that innovation really is about candor, and that is the number one advice that I can give you, and the number one thing that works for the portfolio companies and the industrial groups that we work for at the forefront of innovation. So that is the first takeaway I'd like to leave you with. The second takeaway that I'd love to leave you with is innovation is about prioritizing and communicating. And I think I really recommend going on Vimeo and watching Shopify's CTO's video on how we get shit done. And I think there's a couple of takeaways there, but one of the takeaways is, don't take on 25,000 innovation projects at once, right? So people need focus and a clear direction to innovate. You will already be faced with the fear of change and all of the fears that we mentioned above. So, don't overload people on those. It really is one step at a time. So also the issue that you might be faced with if you take on too many innovative projects at once is that the one project that you start might have ripple effects on the second project, and then the overlap will just add complexity and could just really render vain all of the efforts on either one or the second project. So really, again, focus on the one, maybe the two, fine, the three if you're really big, innovative projects that you want to take forward, and just make those very, very crystal clear. The second thing that I really want to touch on is, in that implementation of innovation, once you have that one innovation project that you want to follow, assign one person in charge of that project. Now, many people advise to have an innovation chief or some form of R&D team. I very personally believe that this is the wrong approach for various reasons. One of them is, analysts in the public markets often focus on the amount of a company spends on R&D as an indicator of its competitive strength. But at the end of the day, what really matters is how does that company have processes in place to really rapidly and efficiently translate that R&D effort into products that satisfy customer needs. And that's always been tricky, right? And I think if you take a company like Farfetch, for example, within the tech industry, they have an R&D team within data science, but what they have found really hard is actually integrating all of that data science R&D in the product that they're giving customers. And one example of that is like, how do you integrate the latest machine learning papers into, for example, your customer service chatbot, right? And that is there is such a humongous gap between the priorities of research and development and the priorities of product. And so integration is really, really tough. Now, the second thing is that you also run the risk of R&D teams always being seen as external one-man teams. So, all of the OKRs will be linked to innovation versus what I guess, other employees will see as more operational and hence more vital OKRs. And so innovation really is incompatible with strict roles, complex, organizational charts, and isolated responsibilities. And so, a separate R&D is just really, really tricky to make work. And I think to maybe put a little bit of, history illustration on that, what makes it even harder today is that you have shortening product life cycles, right? So I think there's a statistic out there that says 50% of annual company revenues across industries, so this is not specific to one, but across industries, are derived from new products that were launched within the past 3 years. So, the whole like cash cow product just isn't really as true today. And if you take Volkswagen, for example, like, that from the first introduction of the first generation of Volkswagen Golf models in 74 to the market withdrawal of the Golf 5 in 2008, the product life cycles have been shortened from 9 to 5 years, so roughly 50%, while the cumulative sales of that product generation have moved from basically the Golf 1 at 6.8 million to Golf 5 at 2.6 million. So you just have the product life cycles that are so compressed that, like, implementing R&D is just nearly impossible, because by the time you finished researching, implementation is just over. You don't have time. You already have to start R&Ding the next one. And so I think that is, one complexity that's added to the world of today. And the second one is just increasing variety due to, simple consumerism, D2C brands, et cetera, et cetera. So in the 80s, the Mercedes-Benz range was basically 5 models. Today, it's 28. And the number of configurations is just multiplied over. There's 18K door trim variants for one of the Audis, and one of the BMWs are 90,000 headliner variants. That is insane, and there's an insane amount of complexity. So, I think the key here is basically, at least personally, I say no to R&D teams, especially not within startups, and instead, implement innovation by choosing the best person for the job. And that is, the person that will be best placed to implement will be either by skills. So, in the machine learning example, whoever you have on the team that is, best placed to have the skills to implement that project, or simply by motivation, right? Who is the most motivated person within my organization to, organize the next whatever, innovation we have on the line. And so, being able to pick that right person, and then very clearly making that innovative project success a part of their OKRs, and hence of their time split. So, telling them you can dedicate 20% of your time to this project is something that will give them a lot of agency to say no to other things, and hence push that project forward, and not the typical, oh yes, we're going to do this super innovative project, and then no one ever takes ownership for it. And then, if someone takes ownership for it, then it, becomes deprioritized along the way, because we all have better things to do than to innovate, because it's such a long-term thing anyway. So I think that is really the second, the second piece of advice that I wanted to give you today. So again, the first one really is innovation is about candor. The second one really is innovation is about prioritizing and communicating properly, and assigning that project to the right person. So, I guess those are the two main pieces of advice I wanted to give you, and I think those are the two most important ones. On a closing note, I would love to point out the fact that sometimes you have to accept that the fruits of your innovative culture will not be written by your own organization. And so, are you okay with that? Now, let me put a bit of color on that. So I'll go back to a company called Fairchild, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and what have subsequently been called the Fairchildren. So AT&T back in the day sprouted the now very well-renowned Bell Labs, and out of Bell Labs came a company called Fairchild in the semiconductor industry. Now, Fairchild's own market valuation never exceeded 2.5 billion, but the combined valuation of its surviving progeny is around 2 trillion. Why? Because Fairchild itself got outpaced by the speed of innovation in semiconductors, but in the process, a very substantial number of its employees founded spin-offs, who then founded spin-offs, who then founded spin-offs, et cetera, until, according to one of the Endeavor Insights reports, in 2014, of the more than 130 Silicon Valley tech companies trading on the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange, 70% of these firms can be traced directly back to the founders and employees of Fairchild. And the 92 public companies that can be traced to Fairchild are now worth about 2.1 trillion, which is more than the annual GDP of Canada or Spain. So, it's sad to say that, you know, sometimes the fruit of your innovative culture and the innovations that come from your company will not be ripped by your company. But either way, you know, I think that's a pretty powerful statement when it comes to Fairchild to innovative culture. And even if, you know, even if Fairchild fell into almost oblivion compared to its direct descendants, which are, you know, by the way, the Apples and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, you know, if you love innovation as much as I do, then, you know, don't be a talent hoarder, and definitely build that innovative culture and then pass it on to the next one and to the next company. So so yeah, so that's, you know, that's me. If we have time, I'm happy to take questions. So Trevor, happy to take those if you've seen any. I haven't actually been timing, so hopefully I'm not too much over time, and we've got time for a few Q&A.
Hello.
Hey, Trevor.
So Esther, thank you very much. I wrote down a couple questions. I don't know if anyone asked any, but so I wanted to ask. What is the difference in implementation of the ideas you talked about today between small and maybe larger organizations? Because, you know, smaller organizations, innovation is expensive, and innovation, you know, I think for a lot of startups would be considered a risk because you do have a certain amount of money and time to deliver results. So what would be, I guess, you know, from your standpoint, the key differences in how to go about this between maybe an early stage startup and somebody that maybe has their foot in the ground a little bit?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the main difference will effectively be on the complexity of that. So, you know, what you can't hear me, but you know, one of the things that we see very strongly is that obviously for startups, the innovation almost comes by design, because the size of the organization means that the implementation tactics that I talked about, particularly on, you know, organizing and making sure that one person has agency, is just a lot easier. You know, when you have a team of like 4 people, you know, 5, 6, 7, like 10 people, it's just really much easier to have this like all hands alignment. And so that means, you know, everyone will at some point or another be willing to, you know, implement an innovative project or another. Everyone, you know, will be able to chip in and have their voice heard, and it's a lot easier to create that, you know, brain trust like, you know, formation where 10 people just go into a room, sit around the table, and then openly discuss with, you know, a bunch of pizza. And that's just very by design much easier to do in smaller organizations, be it, you know, being tech startup or be it, you know, small SMEs, for example. So I think they definitely have an edge there. When you have, you know, industrial groups, what becomes very difficult is, again, what I mentioned before, you know, innovation is not really suited to having particular roles and particular strict hierarchies. And so what they have to deal with is the complexity of, okay, now not only do I have 10 people, but I have 2,000. I can't put 2,000 people within, you know, one room. And so then it becomes a matter of, you know, either doing it per, you know, per department, or, you know, having a good communication system that can be replicated across all of the levels of the organization. So effectively, you know, either a brain trust that cuts across, you know, all levels of hierarchy, if you call it that, or a brain trust that can be, you know, replicated across, you know, horizontally across different levels of the organization. So so I think that's the main difference in implementing, and just, you know, finding the right you know, the right person to give responsibility to that project, and then giving visibility to the rest of the organization as to who is the responsible person and who is accountable for that, and who will give direction to the project. So so yeah, thank you so much everyone for having me. I hope it was insightful. Any questions, do reach out on LinkedIn, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Hope the rest of the event is fantastic for you guys. And yeah, thank you again for having me.